Welcome, Faltra, come the Wes. Welcome to the Paisley Book Festival. It's wonderful to be here with you at home, and to get to begin the third and final of a series of events on language. My name's Harry Josephine Giles, Josie for short, and I'm really pleased today to be hosting Roseanne Watt and Pàdraig MacAoidh. Two fantastic writers working in Scotland's minority languages and in English as well. And we're here as three writers from islands thinking about islands and language and what it is to be writing from an island position and what words mean from that island perspective. We're going to kick off with a poem from each of our poets here. But first, I just want to introduce you a little bit to their work. Roseanne Watt is a writer, filmmaker, and musician from Shetland. Her dual language debut collection, Pdraig, was published by Polygon in May 2019 after receiving the prestigious Edwin Morgan Poetry Award for Scottish poets under 30. Pdraig subsequently received both an Eric Gregory and a Somerset Maugham Award in 2020 and was named joint winner of the Highland Book Prize in 2019. Pàdraig MacAoidh, or Peter Mackay, is a native Gaelic speaker from the Isle of Lewis. He's an academic, writer and broadcaster whose work is influenced by the diverse linguistic heritage of his birthplace. With an MA from Glasgow University and a PhD from Trinity College Dublin, Mackay has worked at the Seamus Heaney Centre for Poetry, Queen's University Belfast, Trinity College Dublin and University College Dublin, and at Salma Rostock when he was writer in residence. His books include Gu Leòr in 2015 and Nàdur in 2020. So, Roseanne and Peter, welcome. It's wonderful to be here with you. And I think I failed to actually say which of you was going to go first.
I've been sitting here like wondering which one of us will go first.
We got so into the discussion that I left the admin behind. Roseanne, would you be happy to begin with a poem for us?
Thank you, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It is an absolute joy to be joining you. And yes, just two of my favourite island poets working today, so I'm very excited. This poem I'm going to read is called Rengus, which is the Shetland word for a red-throated diver. And we did have some discussion about whether we should be reading translations, and I've decided I'm going to read the English translation, but yeah, maybe that's something we can discuss later in the session. But yes, this is Rengus. Du surely done Shetland, I suppose, a rees of these downtum days. We nane that wants to lure for that sklent o urgent sang at first rivend thy throat. Never lit. There's waterheads in the east, sang silence, their gathering. Rengus. You're surely exhausted, singing your prophecies of storms in these downpour days, with none who want to listen for that long tear of urgent song which first ripped open your throat. Never heed. Columns of cloud are rising in the east. Song or silence, they gather.
I muted myself because I was so keen not to interrupt your style. Thank you for that poem, and thank you for that choice. It's a beautiful poem and one that's really grand to come back to in this context. And in the context of this event, I'm now noticing things in it that I hadn't noticed before, and how much of it is about the anxieties of whether or not your words are being listened to, and whether it matters whether or not they're being listened to. It's sort of the inverse of a tree falling in the forest. Like,
yeah.
If I'm speaking and nobody understands me, does it matter if the clouds are still there? I love that. And I'm interested if am I reading too much into that, or is that there for you? And I suppose when you're writing a poem like that, who is it that you're writing for? Who is it that you hope is going to listen to a poem like that?
Oh, those are such good questions. And like that's actually a really interesting point you're making there about the kind of linguistic context of it. Because I feel like I do often write with the linguistic context in mind, but for that poem in particular, I was actually thinking more about the associated lore with that bird, which I probably should have mentioned before I started. I'm quite rusty in this whole poetry reading practice. So the lore of the Rengus is that depending on the sound of its call or the direction of its flight, it can predict the weather. And for me, the poem comes from a kind of like concern for more of the physical environment. But you're so right that it can be read in terms of that linguistic environment and the loss of words, I guess. We're trying to avoid the word loss here, by the way, but I've accidentally brought it about myself.
You've got one free pass. We had just for the audience at home, we had an agreement before we started that we weren't going to mention
I've already
and we weren't going to mention the word
rules.
nostalgia. So that's your one pass, okay? And if you do it again, I'll have to kick you out.
Oh, I'm so sorry. No, but I mean, in terms of like, for me, reconnecting with Shetland, which I had like kind of left behind when I was young, and was like throughout most of my teenage years did not speak much Shetland outside of family situations, and that was not really like a conscious choice so much as like just the circumstances of like being at school, having not very many Shetland speaking friends, having native Shetland friends, but who didn't speak Shetland. And that's like such a thing for me. And when I return to Shetland, it's like returning to a connection to not just the language itself, but also the island and the things which it describes. And that aspect of it is what I found so enriching, is that there are these words that really only describe the landscape of the place that I'm from. Like Wetherhead is like these huge columns of clouds that you can see on the horizon because there's no trees here. The horizon is just like always visible. So the skies are huge. And that's like the existence of those words is like, yeah, just so it reminds me of like the kind of interrelational aspect of these minoritized language, like how it returns you to a sense of relationship with the place. And that's so that's what felt really like, yeah, just like it's like that your interpretation there, it's just like, and once again reminds me of like, yeah, it always comes back to that for me. It's always that like here it is, the physical landscape being like informed and shaped by like, no, vice versa, sorry, the language being shaped by the landscape. And yeah, that what a ramblings.
No, it's not
so
a ramble.
sorry.
I just wanted to keep listening because it's true, and I think we'll have plenty of time to get into this question of the interrelationship of language and land. I think that is important for us here. But first, Pàdraig, what have you brought for us today?
What I've brought, I thought it was really interesting listening to Roseanne there, and I'm going to try and introduce mine in relation to that, because it's partly about the idea of the relationships between languages, but also the isolations involved and that in betweenness. This is a poem that's actually after a Macedonian poem by Katica Kulavkova, and I was lucky to be involved in a translation workshop with a couple of Macedonian poets last year. Great thing to do during any lockdowns is online poetry translation workshops. Keeps you going. Because I wasn't that well prepared, I hadn't realized that the main topic of Macedonian poetry for the last couple of decades was going to be the lack of recognition, the lack of having a coherent, stable country that's recognized internationally. And many of the metaphors that were used in the Macedonian poetry ended up actually relating back to the position of Gaelic, say, or the position of Scottish Islands. So this is a poem called Pluto, in the voice of the planet, or is it a planet? I forget where we are just now. Pluto. Show me. Mahashaif kam anyachig nyo fuse merhill. A ket orra fo or in rian grenie. Maar kan bij inren vinnum, a froch a mui raad na monchich le prospik ikach inyak. Kan het gyfer mi imavoch, ach ha mi an chesfien yn jonioch gach am heen. Seo mi cho ifranach sa hylete, na ma bheantans ma rinch yn rochis ma vrat methane, nitrogen a CO2, ha mi cho pwysient yr ila hawri an y nish. Ha chi gwrs solish fasgorams, co yw in chasacam an an dorchatis bi fwante. Ha mi a gra bi fwant ach fat yn romi a ticsyn chi gitcher ag sy'r chinas chachorum, na chyl mwyd cwtramach an an dois yn bi. Ha mi'n ystannyn an ystad yn ennichtje acha coi gawych ac ams ha mi giri tilich, baby. Ha mi gol sŵl yr croech yn ys ffrins. Sio mi, y siawn, chain yn aus chorgot o laf. An an os yn tai sienja atgan an glasgu ach gyda fa mi rif cet o'r mhi mar fiawnd yn or chyndol dynnu y tor sŵmgo. O ha boan ach gynawn y fi nioanichtje, fi bio yr criwch et y da uterus. Gygyr am mierich, ik mi scrib am heen. Pluto. Here I am, whether you recognize me or not, looking at you from the edge of the galaxy, as if I was a loner living out the peat road with a telescope at each window. You'll say that I'm remote, but I'm in the middle of my own nothing. Here I am as hellish as you'd imagine, with my mountains and frozen plains and my cloak of methane, nitrogen and CO2. I'm as poisonous as a summer day in Ness. Your light won't come close to me. I've at least 1 foot in eternal darkness. I say eternal, but it's ages since I understood time, and it strikes me that size doesn't really matter at all. I am thinner than the United States, but I have 5 moons and want more, baby. I have my eye on Nez Princess Croft. Here I am singing Chown and Ows Love in the corner of a pub somewhere in Glasgow. And though I always thought of myself as a lump of gold, no one pays me any attention. There are advantages in anonymity, living between 2 authorities. At last orders, I'll go for a stroll by myself.
Thank you so much again for the poem and for that choice of poem. It hadn't occurred to me before what a good metaphor Pluto is for the possession of modernity. It's perfect. It's ready and waiting out there in a trans-Neptunian orbit all this time. And I was thinking through that poem how, there was such a fuss about Pluto's supposed demotion from planet to dwarf planet. And that poem with Pluto in the center of its own nothing made me think, well, isn't it actually a promotion that Pluto gets to leave these big ugly things behind and join the community of dwarf planets, because there's plenty of them, and we're not going to find any more of the big ones, but we're finding more dwarf planets and planetoids all the time, and Plutos, and they're expanding in their significance in the solar system. So I suppose what attracted you to this poem, and what does that mean for something to be in the centre of its own nothing? What is that for you?
Well, I had to nick the metaphor, as you said. The metaphor was just sitting there. When I saw it being used by somebody else, I thought, how could you not identify this? I quite like the idea, well, the two things of being on the edge, the remoteness, so that if there is a solar implosion, maybe Pluto will just avoid the gravitational pull of the black hole that'll pull the rest of the solar system in and get to go and do its own thing. But I imagine you'll both have had the question, what was it like growing up on X? It was where I grew up. How am I meant to measure
Completely
its
normal.
difference?
Completely
Completely
normal.
normal.
How weird for you to grow up wherever you grew up.
Yeah, but I can't understand growing up in a city. Going down to the shop whenever you want to, not being able to walk onto the moor and 5 minutes being away from humanity. That's reality and normality for me. Anything else is just a bit weird. And so I think and this isn't a question about minority languages or about cultures, but it's individuals. We are all in the middle of our own, however we want to define it. And nothingness is as useful a way to define it for me as any other way. And I quite like the unrootedness of that, as well as the idea of going back to an island and knowing, and I think for all of us, island living is also a weird return to islands as well. So it's a recreation of it each time that we go to Shetland or Orkney or Lewis. And there is this sense of having the unrootedness allows you to think it through differently each time. And there's an emotional cost that comes to this, and there's a difficulty that comes to this. But I think that allows you to play with it a bit more.
Thank you. Yeah, there's something in there, I think, about not just island language, island writing, but how for us at least, and you've both spoken to this, there's a relationship there between island and city, or so-called periphery and so-called center, in the same way that a dwarf planet is not a planet, it's a dwarf planet. Is a minority language actually a language, or is it always a minority language? So just staying with you for a moment, Peter, what's happening in that relationship between island and city for you, as somebody who moves between them physically, and also, I suppose, imaginatively as well?
I'm not entirely sure. I have to question every so often, do I have a right, say, to be in an event called Island Words? Since I live in Edinburgh and I've lived before that in Glasgow, Belfast, Dublin, Barcelona, and have been away from Lewis for a long time as the environment that surrounds myself. So there is the fear that everything I write might be tinged with the big L word that we're not allowed to say, or the sense of a change that is not part of my own lived experience of that change, that I am not in the center of seeing a community evolving around me, and everything I do, am I remote from that community, whatever that community is and however it wants to define itself. And there are discussions in Gaelic at the moment about, and there is discussions about who gets to represent Gaelic, or if there is a vernacular community that should be supported as a priority on the islands, or whether there are communities in the cities as well that should have equal levels of support, and whether you're defining the language in terms of ethnicity, of an acquired language, as a choice, as something that you choose to do or something that you're born into. And many of these conversations are worrying, partly because the minute you go into an ethnic definition, I was born in Lewis, I can trace my family back generations, I don't live there anymore. What kind of ethnic status does that give me? What kind of ethnic status does it give people that are in that same position but who did not speak Gaelic when they were young and don't speak Gaelic now? Are they Gaels or not? Do you have to have is it a matter of a language, or is it a matter of blood and a birthright, or whatever it's going to be, or blood and soil? And these are messy conversations to have. Let's not have them.
Yeah, obviously these anxieties of representation speak to me as well, and I wonder if they ring in some way for you, Roseanne, or how you're approaching that as well in your own work, as somebody that has lived in city, has lived in Shetland, and again also kind of moves between both in the imagination.
Oh yeah, so there's lots to think about there. I find that when I first started writing Shetland in earnest, it was at university when I was at Stirling University, and somehow writing from that distance felt actually like easier somehow, as though the pressure was kind of off. Like I could imagine, like it was just like, oh, I'm just doing this kind of like as a fun little experiment, and like it's not too serious, because I think in Shetland it's a very weighty topic, and you feel a lot of responsibility as soon as you start to engage with dialect, because it feels like there's a lot of stakes involved. At least that was the situation for me when I was first began writing and like putting my work out in a more public way. And the question from Shetlanders was always, are you writing in dialect? Like, where's your Shetland like poetry? And it's like, I haven't done it yet. I don't know. It's so scary. And I felt a lot like I felt like a bit phony because of like the whole not being a full-blooded Shetlander. Like my mom is Irish, and like I had felt as though I had abandoned part of my Shetland identity through not speaking it for years and years. And then yeah, that is a messy concern, but it's there. And then I started writing it, and it was just very positive. Like the support was incredible, and I think that like a lot of the kind of debates that I had been aware of and the anxieties I had been aware of in my head were from a certain set of voices which can speak very loud in like digital spaces and on online forums. And only in the last like 5 years have I seen a shift away from that voice being like the one that you see the most, and to this like towards a more open celebration of like I remember there's a Facebook group called Wyrmider Tongue. I think that is the Orkney equivalent the Revelers group. Yeah, and just like these fantastic like my favorite places on Facebook, which is not exactly a nice site to be on, but the Wyrmider Tongue group are just like, I remember seeing a post by somebody who had grown up in Shetland but had incomer parents and had not been taught dialect at all, but really wanted to engage with it and learn it, and was like, just directly asked the question, is it okay? Am I allowed to do this? And I was like holding my like breath, being like, oh my God, what are these folk going to say to this question? And everybody, there was not a single negative comment saying, you should not engage. You should, like, it's ours, not yours. It was, oh no, if you want to learn it, go ahead, try your best. And just very, like, that was just like a real lovely thing to see. Because I think when I first started engaging with the dialect, there was that conversation was very much like, there was like a lot of feeling about permission, who has permission to speak this. And like, yeah, it was like, I'm me who had grown up in Shetland, having Shetland relatives, and still felt like I didn't have permission. That's a bad place to be. Like, that's not good for the future of the dialect. But I think there has been a shift recently. Oh, I've completely missed out on the city aspect.
No, when you choose to answer the question that you wish I'd asked.
My apologies.
So thank you. And I think you're right there that the anxieties of language, the anxieties of writing from a small place are kind of born of they start to melt away as cultural confidence rises,
yeah,
right? And as personal confidence rises, right? And so let's let's move out of this like anxious space. We spend way too much time in as poets
Yes,
anyway, and
absolutely.
especially as minority language poets. And I want to ask what writing in minority languages and writing from an island perspective gives to your work. What does it enrich in your work? What are some of the gifts of that you're glad for? And to give you a moment to just to give you a moment to think about that, I'll say what I should have said at the top, which is if any of you watching at home have got questions, please put them in the chat in whichever website you're watching on, and those should come through to us. And we're going to have about 15-20 minutes for your questions at the end as well. So thank you. So yeah, Roseanne, what enriches your work from an island perspective?
Oh, well, I loved what Peter said about the kind of claiming your own center, because the narrative from outside is always like, oh, like the word remote is used in ways in which it seems to fail to recognize it as a relative concept. Like, what's we're remote to you, you're remote to us. Like, that's a thing that I find is really beautiful about writing from an island perspective. It's not just like the kind of like getting to hone in on the hyper local and finding like beautiful wisdom in that context as well. The ways in which the words and the grammar operates for me just brings me to a way of thinking or a way of seeing that is hard to explain, but it makes me feel much more embodied in terms of my feeling and my thoughts. It's hard to explain this, but I feel like one of the best ways that I was able to have this articulated was through the question of, when you use these different languages, where do they sit inside your body? And I realized that Shetland sits way back in my head, like way back, and I have to reach for it. And then there are times now since and when I ask myself that question again, there are times when it's like here and it's at the forefront, and it's like that kind of shifting and that relationship with your own like consciousness is really, really powerful, like feeling for me. And to have like my thoughts move from being in English, predominantly in English, to being in Shetland, to dream in Shetland is just like this really remarkable experience. And yeah, so that's one of the things that I love about having this
Sometimes
new
I
vocabulary.
enjoy that move happening over the course of a night.
Yes.
It can happen sometimes. I remember I had a nice night in Sandy Bells with the Orkney poet Heather Young and a couple of German friends, and at the beginning of the night we were all speaking quite happily in English, and then Heather and I just got more and more and more
Yes.
into Orkney. As you know, as we had a few more drams, and
Yeah.
and over the course of the night, this language kind of welled up through our bodies to the point where the
Yes.
Germans couldn't understand us anymore. They could at the beginning, and they couldn't understand us at the end, and I felt kind of proud of that.
Yes.
And
And it's
I don't know if
sorry.
it's the same for both of you, because for me it comes through vowel sounds,
Mhm.
and so the vowel sounds will just shift between languages, and you just feel the back of my jaw, a different language has been spoken there, and just force its way
Yes.
into the English or the Gaelic.
Yes.
Yeah, there's something about the tongue position, I think,
Yeah.
and the shape of the mouth it transforms your physical being. What are some of the gifts for you, Peter? Yeah.
I agree with everything that Roseanne said there. I think if you're going to be writing in any language, what you are wanting to do is to re-energize the language, to do something that has never been done before. That is going to play a slightly different tune on that instrument to make interesting music. If you're doing that in a minority language or between languages, then what you've got is this great facility of saying, by the way, have you seen this other language? It's fantastic. It can do this. It has these notes. It can make this tune happen. And it's not just between, say, Shetland and Orkney and Gaelic and English. It's between all of the other languages of the world as well. You get to share these. And the classic cliches in Gaelic are the colour scheme is different, or you order the natural world in different ways, or you have these different ways of shaping existence. And you can say, by the way, this very exciting thing happens. And as long as you retain the joy of that, it's not a case of using the language as a storehouse or an archive that you are then selling to the world. You are celebrating it. And I think this is what I would hope to do in the poetry. I think I was lucky that I started writing when I was in Ireland. And in some ways, because it was entirely accepted. Why wouldn't you write in your version of Gaelic? And we don't know that you're making grammatical errors, so you can get away with murder. So this was a really nice, in some ways, safe space for that to happen, especially because it was a place where poetry is allowed to happen. And I don't think that's the case in Scotland so much. You don't have a standing army of 10,000 poets in Scotland as you do in Ireland, where anytime you'd get in a taxi, the taxi driver would go, oh yeah, my aunt, cousin, nephew is a poet as well, and expect you to know them. I think there's a lot more freedom to play, to make mistakes in that kind of environment as well. But it's also one in which you can take your own experience, your own hyper local experience, and share it. I loved being able to put my neighbour's croft from home in his prints into the Pluto poem. So you go from the hyper local to the galactic in the 2 lines. I think this is what we can do with smaller languages really easily.
That's really fascinating. And I think it brought up something there which is echoed in both of your answers across the conversation, which is that there's also what you're doing with the language, or what the language means, seems to vary a little bit depending on who the audience is. That something different is happening when you're doing the language in Ireland. Something is different is happening when it happens in Lewis, when it happens in Shetland, when it happens in Glasgow. Do you find yourself speaking to different audiences in different poems, Pàdraig, or do you write one poem and then see how it lands with different people, and the different audiences respond to you in different ways?
I will certainly read different poems for different audiences. And I'm slightly wary that that's made me write them in different ways as well. And so I got accustomed to reading my Gaelic poems first to audiences that were almost entirely non-Gaelic speaking. So you'd drop breadcrumbs in. You'd drop a line of song or an English phrase into the Gaelic so that you then have the moment of recognition when you get to the English language version. Go, okay, this is where we are. Wasn't expecting that. But I think certainly I would speak in Gaelic poems or to a Gaelic audience in a slightly different way than I would assuming it was an Edinburgh readership. And in particular, I get annoyed at Edinburgh readerships or Edinburgh audiences. So I tend to, if I'm in Scottish cities, I'll have more aggressive, bitter poetry. If I'm reading in Ireland, I'll just do pure celebratory things. And if I'm reading to a Gaelic-speaking audience, I'll do things that nobody can understand. So I can try and find out what's going on in them and see if anybody can tell me.
That a lot of that rings very true for me in my own work.
Same.
What about you, Roseanne? Yeah, who are different poems for, and what do they bring out?
Yes, so it's a really great question. I'm not sure if I think too much about, well, at least not in the writing of a poem. I'm not really thinking about the like audience of it. I guess I'm just in a very, very close relationship. It's like me and the language, and then what comes thereafter for me is like that's beyond my control. So what I'm just gonna like I don't tend to engage with that thought process so much. But when it comes to readings, I am definitely conscious of like very conscious when I'm reading to Shetland audiences about this like about the words that I'm using, about my pronunciation of the words, because that's another thing is that I like a lot of the a lot of the words that I use are like from my family, and then the other ones that I found in dictionaries, and have been engaging with like the kind of literary canon, but they're usually like just words I've only ever seen written down, and that's like it's a kind of like awareness of like a learning opportunity. It's like somebody could come up and tell me I'm pronouncing that wrong, and I have to be open to that, and I have to be like not feel too defensive or not defensive, but like ashamed that I got it wrong, because I often feel kind of like, because I've had this period of estrangement from the language itself, I do feel vulnerable and grief around all of the things that I just don't know about it, and like I've got this like yearning to know as much as I can, and Shetland audiences are very, very quiet, so you never know if you've actually succeeded, if they liked it or not. You're just like, oh God. But when it comes to more mainland audiences, especially, I was doing a lot of readings in Edinburgh, then I was making like quite conscious effort to like be as Shetland as possible. Is that, I'm struggling to say the words here, but like I always have this imagined audience member in my mind who's sitting there being like, oh, it's just English spoken funny, and then I'm like, try to understand this then. So I do have that guy in my head.
Oh, I play that game. I love playing that game. Oh yeah. I'm gonna start bringing in some of the audience questions now, actually, because I think this one that's just come in from Heather speaks to that a little bit and builds on what we were just saying, which is, so this is the question from Heather. Have you had opportunities to visit or read at events in other parts of the world with comparable dynamics in terms of minority languages? And if you haven't, are there other kind of language situations that inform the work that you're doing? Let's start with you on that, Roseanne.
Yes, I've so there's two that kind of spring to mind for me. Like right now, I have been working with a stanza translation workshop with Ukrainian poets, and I was paired with a wonderful Ukrainian poet, and we were working in our own dialects, and we translated each other's work into our dialects, and it was a really like beautiful experience, because the poet I was working with, Miloslav, he lives in I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Carpathian Mountains, a very mountainous part of Ukraine, and it was like the context of that kind of context with the poem that I gave him to translate. He was able to create a sense of islandness because of the geography and the place that his dialect came from. There were words which he could use, not necessarily. It's like he's like I had like a catfish in my poem, and he was like, there is no word for saltwater fish, but there is words for freshwater fish, and like finding like the kind of these really like beautiful conceptual translations between our dialects. And it was just, it was a really amazing experience, because I was able to take some of his work and like create it with the vocabulary available to me in Shetland. And that's something I love about your work, Josie, is that it's a moment to be very creative, isn't it? When you don't have the perfect word to translate it, then you go for with gas giants. I think is it Jotuns in Deep Wheel Arcadia, and it's such a a playful and imaginative thing to be able to do. It's like, we always get asked that question. It's like, oh, do you find it limiting working in a minoritized language? And I'm like, no, it's like when there's no words available, then that's where you get to be at your most creative. And that's another thing that you're doing wonderful work with, Josie, is the queer vocabulary in Scots, which is just fantastic. The word outwither for non-binary. How wonderful is that? So yeah, great.
Well, thank you. Usually as a host, you get to like avoid having the praise of the audience and your work.
No, sorry. You're just too successful and talented, and you're not getting away with it.
I liked how you pointed out there one of the other gifts, I think, of island work, of minority language work, which is that when you speak a small language and you speak a dialect, wherever you go in the world, you find the other ones.
Yes.
And wherever you go, you run into somebody who you thought just spoke Spanish or French, and then you get to speak, and then you find out, oh no, they actually don't. They speak a dialect, they speak a minority version of it, and then you start to have a conversation that other folk don't get to have, which is quite nice. Has that happened for you, Peter?
I think it's lovely. You get to explore the cracks in the edifices of other countries, other cultures, other places to do that. I've been quite lucky. I've done quite a lot of translation work, some Catalan, some Irish, German, Slovakian, and Czech. And largely it's because in every country you go to, you'll find a minority language or you'll find a dialect that is striving for recognition. And especially because Gaelic is a relatively high profile version of that, then people come searching you out going, by the way, what are you doing? What are you up to? And there's most of the many interesting conversations I've had about poetry in the last 5 to 10 years are along that lines. It's working in the in the arm space of the major languages. It's working, trying to find ways of creating different bridges, different linkings between languages, but especially when it goes wrong, and that's always when it's the most fun. And so again, Josie, I love what you do in Deep Wheel Arcadia and using the half fishing and all of the puns that come in when you can't translate. The most recent one I was playing around with was a poem from Occitan, and my Occitan ain't great. My Catalan's okay, so between the Catalan and the French, I can almost work it out, by Frederick Fichac, about the bird, the oriole. And we don't have a word in Gaelic for the oriole. So I have to decide, do I turn it into a guca? Do I turn it into something else? Or do I take the oriole with all of its golden plumage into Gaelic and have this wonderful exotic element? But it's just so much fun to be able to make that choice.
Yeah, Occitan was an interesting one for me. I a few years ago got to do translations from Aurélie Lassac, which was fascinating work, finding another of these languages that I didn't know about. It taught me a lot. Okay, I'm gonna ask the big question now, which I forewarned you about backstage, which is, with all of these hopes and gifts and delights in language, what do you think the futures of these languages that we speak and write in are? And I think maybe more importantly, what is the role of poetry in that, in making that future or not? Yeah. What's the future of our tongues, and what's poetry for? I'll stick with you, Peter, for that one, and then we'll move to.
I was trying at some point for something I was writing at the moment last year to work out when I was told first that you are speaking in a dying language and what that does to you, and the emotional weight that comes with. And it was probably about 8 or 9 that you have the sense that this culture that you're in is dying or minoritized or might not have a future. And this can weigh heavy. And it's a heavy thing to put on the shoulders of children, especially when you are the culture bearers of something into the future. You have this responsibility. And I understand why quite a few people will leave the language or stop speaking the language as they get older. And then Stu McNackle argues from this that the Gael has been dying for over 2,000 years. If you go back to the dying Gaul, he has a pun on Gaul and Gael. And so that every generation you are told you are maybe the last generation and this is a dying language. And then 200, 400 years, it's still there. It's evolved, it's changed, it's a different kind of language with different powers, different abilities, but it has continued. I'd love to be optimistic. I'd love to think that it'll still be here and spoken as a community language in the islands and then across Scotland in 200, 300, 400 years. It will evolve. It'll be different. There will be people at the time going, oh, it's nowhere near as good as it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It's nowhere near as pure or as rich. But that's what happens with languages. They change. What's the role of literature? Well, if we're going to go out, you go out singing and you make as beautiful a noise as you can while you can.
What a lovely answer.
That's the perfect answer.
Go out singing if we're going out. Okay. Roseanne, what about you? What are your sort of thoughts about the future and poetry's role in it?
Gosh, it's such a, I honestly, I sway between optimism and despair, like every like other week. My main thing that I've been noticing is that like the young folk really do want to engage with Shetland, and there is that shyness, and there is still that kind of like, oh, I don't know if I'm allowed, and that lingers. And the way it seems to, like, young folk seem to express Shetland most these days is in kind of like an ironic context. It's like where they're like doing a voice and making jokes, and it's not mockery. It's not like mocking the dialect, but it is like only the only times it's getting properly used is like in this kind of like, yeah, this kind of really ironic way. And that's in day-to-day speech. In literary terms, Shetland is like doing great. I think there's lots of people like who have been like flying the flag for it across like the centuries, but it's been in terms of like the where it is with young folk and the spoken aspect, the conversational side of it, I do worry about that. And but I do think poetry has a part to play, and I think the focus I would like to start seeing in Shetland is a return to the performance of it, and a return to the performance of it in like in public settings. And the thing that I would like to do now that I'm permanently back in Shetland is to have those kind of events happening again. It's not an ideal time for that to be happening right now in the pandemic eras that we have entered. But the thing that I'm hoping most for Shetland is young folk to pick it up and to like just learn to be comfortable with the estrangement that you've undergone, knowing that it wasn't your fault. That's a really hard thing to come to terms with. Yeah, so countering estrangement is part of the future for Shetland, I think.
I think you've hit on some really kind of key aspects of all of this, and it loops a bit back into the anxiety that we begin with, doesn't it? And how the irony that is, it's very common, at least to Scots speech, the different forms of Scots speech, as a way of dealing with that estrangement,
Yes.
as you say. And also there's this peculiar gulf between that irony, that oral irony, and then the confident literature.
Yes, and it's very, I wouldn't want to ever say that the irony is bad, or like it's like a lot of the humor is hilarious and like great, but it's very much over, like it's overdone, or like not. It's the only way it's being represented at the moment that I'm seeing amongst youngsters, and yeah, I hope that a sense of earnestness, I guess, in expression could return. Sincerity, I don't know.
So from those huge futures, we've got a somewhat kinder question that's come in from Ross. which is, I'm interested to know what each writer is currently working on, or if they have any work they'd like to create that plays with these ideas of multilingualism. So from the big futures to your personal futures, what are you working on, Roseanne? What's coming up next for you in this field?
So I've been working on a kind of project which incorporates the dialects of Scotland. It has come to my attention that a lot of the dictionaries give definitions only in English, never in Scots. So I've kind of come up with this hybrid project, which is like part poetic definitions of words. It's wild words from all of Scotland's dialects. It returns to that kind of hyper-local idea that these words come from places in Scotland rather than just like, here's an old Scottish word that nobody uses anymore, and it's a vague definition, never given a living context. So I'm kind of, been trying to work on a project like that, and it's coming out in August, I believe.
That's really exciting to hear. As somebody who, as you know, has spent some time tilting at Twitter accounts.
Yes. Oh my goodness. And it's
trying to get certain propagators of language to stop using the phrase old Scottish words.
Yeah. I know there's been so many times that the word shurmel has come up, and it's like, that's a word that we use up here all the time. Please stop saying it's dead and gone.
Oh dear.
You and your archaisms.
What's coming up for you, Pàdraig?
I don't really know. At the moment, what I'm working on is the classic non-fiction essay kind of thing, because I do academic work as well as writing poetry, and so this is somewhere in between. It allows me to play with ideas which don't necessarily have to have poetic lines and which don't need to have footnotes. So it's something in between that, and they don't need to make sense. So I've been writing a series of essays in Gaelic only, because I'm not sure anybody else has done this first. So I think, I dread to think what kind of readership this might have. If you're out there and you want this, please let me know and I'll finish it. But it's playful essays. The one I'm writing on at the moment is about the idea of laughter and whether we are actually allowed to laugh as Gaelic speakers or minority language speakers, because you always have these images of the Highlands in films, things like Whiskey Galore or Brigadoon or The Wicker Man, where laughter takes on a really weird tone. It's this almost canned laughter. And you realize then that the laughter in the film is the laughter of the audience at the communities. So I'm trying to find, okay, where are you actually allowed to make healthy, happy, humorous fun? I don't know how to use any of these words, but what kind of laughter is allowed to you? And it's not just the irony, because the ironic laughter does seem to be one that is cutting away at yourself as well. So what kinds of humor can we have? I don't know if it's going to be funny. I hate the thought of writing about laughter and it not being funny, so I'm going to try.
Oh, that sounds great, though.
I'll be glad to hear
much
more
needed.
about that.
Yeah.
I will continue hastening my own Gaelic learning just so I can read that essay. Honestly, it's one of many good aims. You've both in those answers pointed to something which leads us to another of the audience questions. I think this is likely to be the last of those, although do fire away if audience, if you have got any more. And this also points to a wee controversy we mentioned at the beginning, which is how do the authors feel about providing a glossary or an English translation to their work? What is the role of English in your work? Peter, what about you? When do you translate, and when, as with this essay, do you not?
Well, with the essay, I'll probably translate 2 years down the line, but leave a space beforehand. With each of my poems, I tend to start in Gaelic, and then at some stage in the drafting process, I'll see if it works in English as well. And then quite often as I redraft them, they'll grow apart. So quite often there will be an English cousin or an English-speaking cousin to the Gaelic poem. And I'm really happy for them to be quite different, because I think there has to be a space in which the Gaelic exists by itself. And if you're bilingual, if you can read both, you get the added fun of seeing where I've gone wrong or where I've made mistakes or where I'm deliberately playing with the English speaker or the English audience and giving them different information or playing different, pulling the wool over their eyes in different ways. I'm entirely happy with having English for most of my poems alongside it, simply because from my earliest memories, I've been bilingual. I've existed in both languages, and I'm happy to engage with the world in both of them, as long as I'm not beholden to the other self, as long as each self has its own fun to some extent.
What about you, Roseanne? Do you always translate? Do you sometimes prefer not to?
I tend to translate unless there's like time constraints. I tend to translate, but if it's a situation where you have like 2 minutes to read a poem, then I probably wouldn't translate. I'll just be like, listen, it's fine. You can understand most of it, I'm sure. And then they'll be like, I didn't understand. But the relationship for me between the translations is I call in my first, like in Pdraig and collection, I call them uneasy translations, because there is a part of me that worries that that will be the only thing read in I provide them reluctantly, because I do want these poems to be read as they are in Shetland, and I want the Shetland to be the language in which they are thought of and not the English. In terms of glossaries, I am very, very pro-glossary, not only because I think that it's like just a good courtesy to do, but also because in Shetland, I'm aware of the young people who want to learn these words, and this is a chance for me to provide that to them. It's like saying, here, this is what this means, and you can incorporate it into your day-to-day use as well. And it's like, yeah, an opportunity. I provide glossaries mainly on that basis. It's like, let's all learn these new great words that we all have fallen out of touch with.
Well, with that that debate on translation and that knowledge of sometimes in the English translation you're holding back secret information that is just for some folk or twisting things in a different way. I thought it would be nice to hear a final short poem from each of you, and I'll leave it to your discretion whether you give this audience, whose languages we don't know, a translation or not. So I suppose this time let's begin with yourself, Peter.
So I'm going to do a poem in Gaelic and in English. This is a poem that I find it impossible to translate into English, and it's designed to be impossible to translate into English because the last words in it don't have the specificity in English. So it gets really boring in the English. I'm going to leave you on a boring note. Cyrsión. Nuair a hican lá as an sneach na bhaid agus an bíon bearchúile, fa chachach is mar an beag dúst. Snach go fat a hiroch jom bealach fód, no lanners French na Glasgow no fuse aident. Gun lorog no faclas an biaw nach runch an galus cioban, muke gach glawn is galans to laf heen chaus an sneach. Siet seo is sturis to yachi. Loch kjartravat, loch maravat, stjena klitsch. Kles, slukken, sloosrich, olveroch, klotak, jomak, spintak. Why? The second last line has the literal translations of words, a la MacDermid in that way. When the day comes and the snow is lying until the entire ridge is beneath a drift, almost of dust, and you can't see your own handiwork or the pass below you or the glitter of the streets of Glasgow or even an ident. With no trace or word there but white meadows and empty mists suffocating each glen, each erratic, and your own hands lost in the snow, it is these that will lead you home. Loch Kjartravat, Loch Maravat, Stjena sleight of hand, gullet, water washing up and down a beach, transmarine, snowflake, snowflake. snowflake.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Do you have a final word for us, Roseanne?
I do indeed. So this is a poem called The Slock at Light. And I wrote it for my friend Adam. Maybe it's that mun in thy veins, a lump of the blood it set do here, or maybe du just kent this island had its wilt things close. Whatever why du seems to find thyself mist, where the licht is slocket, helliers, vodhuses, du stain by the visiks at their stons, the why a voice soon's there, vernenst the swar of the dim. I'm going to read the translation, but with this little secret I will tell you is that in English, the ending sounds much, much more depressing than in the Shetland. So maybe it's that moon in your veins, a swell in the blood which sent you here, or maybe you just knew this island holds its lost things close. Whichever way, you seem to find yourself most where the light wrecks, sea caves, ruined houses. You're taken by the folk songs of their stones, the way a voice sounds there, against the darkest point of the dark.
Thank you. Thank you both for both of those poems. They're a wonderful place to leave. I've now got to wish everyone good night, which I'm a bit sad about. Just a couple of things to say before we give thanks for these wonderful writers. There were two other events in this Minding Language series, which will be or are available online. We had a conversation between Raymond Antrobus and Raman Mandir on the theme of double language. And then yesterday, a conversation between Vani Anthony, Ezekiel Capildeo and Juana Adcock on different approaches to translation. So we've got these three events as an exploration of language in poetry as unstable, as something that we can play with and as something that we can question. So if you enjoyed this one, please have a look at those as well. Books for all of those authors, including Roseanne and Pàdraig, are available in the festival bookshop, both in Paisley and at bookshop.org. And of course, there are many other events at the Paisley Book Festival. So please have a look at paisleybookfest.com for some more of those events. So with that, thanks so much for the conversation, both of you. It's such a treat to get to have. I'll treasure it and I'll treasure the poems, and I hope everybody at home will do so as well. Thanks for being with us at home. And if you like to, please tell some other people to watch it back when it comes online. So good night to everyone. Thank you, Roseanne. Thank you, Peter. And we'll speak again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.